Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
And 250 precepts for how a monk should behave, and not one of those talks about having a pager in the Dharma hall. So times change. I like to begin with a piece of music for those of you who are new here. So. One of the things I really like about the GBF is that there's the mixture of practitioners here. Like so, there's Zen practitioners and Theravada practitioners and Vajrayana practitioners, etc. And there's more than a few people here who practice in non-Buddhist traditions as well and appear here. I think that has a lot of creative potential. I think something really interesting could come out of the GBF from that respect, like that, those kind of cross currents. It's kind of unique. I mean, most Buddhist groups are devoted to a particular tradition, and preserving a particular tradition and a particular perspective. So the cross currents here are very interesting. And what I'd like to do today is give an overview of different Buddhist schools and how they perceive the Dharma and how they interpret the Buddhist tradition. I mean, obviously, I can't do a thorough scholastic analysis, in a short talk, but I just like to touch on the various traditions, so as a way of beginning a kind of maybe a dialogue or a crosstalk about the different traditions. I think it was last month, or maybe it was 2 months ago, that I gave a talk on the Four Noble Truths. So to refresh everyone's memory, the first noble truth is the truth of suffering, and the second noble truth is that there is a cause to suffering, and the third noble truth is that it is possible to bring an end to suffering. The third noble truth is cessation, the cessation of suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the path to the end of suffering. So one way of understanding different Buddhist schools is all different Buddhist schools are a response to these Four Noble Truths. Right? So, for example, given the fact that everyone is suffering, how do you interpret that? So different schools will interpret the meaning of suffering in different ways. Or given this third noble truth, the truth of cessation, well, how exactly do you bring that about? What are the means whereby you bring about the end of sorrow? So once again, different schools will interpret the third noble truth in different ways, and that will have implications for the practice of a particular tradition. Does that make sense? Incidentally, especially people who are new, I don't mind being asked questions, or you don't have to necessarily save them for the end. And one of the ways that different traditions interpreters, they look at the Four Noble Truths and they perceive some of the Noble Truths as what they call absolute truths, and the other truths are relative truths or circumstantial truths. This gets a little abstract, and I won't dwell on it very long, but if you do some reading in Buddhism, you will come across this kind of analysis. So the second noble truth, that there is a cause to suffering, is often interpreted in traditions as an absolute truth, because everything is derived from causes and conditions. There is nothing in existence which exists independently or separately. That's the meaning of the second noble truth. But the first noble truth, that people are suffering, is not an absolute truth. It is a contingent truth. An absolute truth means a truth that never changes. It's always present. See? A contingent truth means that it is circumstantial, due to conditions, dependent upon conditions. See? But the third noble truth says that one can bring about an end to suffering, which makes the first noble truth a relative truth, the circumstantial truth. So how do you interpret that? How do you deal with these kinds of categories? Before I go further, there is a model which is very prevalent, which I'd like to briefly discuss, which categorizes the Buddhist schools into what are called Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. How many of you have heard this kind of model? It's kind of a three-tiered model, and the interpretation usually given is that Theravada Buddhism is depending on your point of view, if you're a Theravada Buddhist, then Theravada Buddhism is the original pure Buddhism. If you're not a Theravada Buddhism, then it is a truncated form of the complete Buddhism. And then Mahayana Great Vehicle Buddhism is an expanded reaching out of the Buddhist Dharma. And Vajrayana Buddhism, especially if you are a Vajrayana Buddhist, is the pinnacle of the Buddhist teaching. The problem with this model, other than the fact that it's inherently critical of the teachings that are beneath the top one, the problem with this model is it doesn't apply very well to specific Buddhist schools. For example, in Japan and China, there's a school of Buddhism called Tendai Buddhism. That hasn't reached the West very strongly, but it's a very important school of Buddhism in China and Japan, Tendai Buddhism. And they incorporate into their teachings certain Vajrayana practices, mandalas, rituals, right? And esotericism, but they don't consider that the ultimate teaching. The ultimate teaching they considered the Lotus Sutra, which is not an esoteric teaching, but an exoteric teaching. So how does this model adjust to that kind of presentation of the Dharma? It doesn't fit.
What's exoteric?
Public. Esoteric means secret. Another example would be Pure Land Buddhism. And there are schools of Pure Land Buddhism which have visualization, highly elaborate visualization practices, which are very strongly reminiscent of Vajrayana practices. So where would Pure Land Buddhism, which is a devotional form of Buddhism, fit into this scheme when it uses these kinds of, quote, Vajrayana practices? So what I'm suggesting is that it doesn't work. That the other reason it doesn't work. So I remember my teacher, Sun Sanim, when he would give once a year he'd have a teaching retreat for his students who had become teachers, right? And he'd say, there is Hinayana Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and then Zen. So that was his three-tiered scheme. And what I've discovered is that anyone who's any Mahayana Buddhist who is deeply committed to their school presents their teaching in that three-tiered scheme. So Nichiren Buddhists, for example, there's Hinayana Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and then Nichiren's interpretation of the Lotus Sutra is the supreme teaching of the Buddha. So obviously they can't all be right here. So it's kind of just a scheme to say that my school is the best. So I'd like to offer an alternative model. And I call it the lotus of Buddhism, where all the different schools, I interpret all the different schools of Buddhism as like petals on a flower. Okay? And so that way they're not arranged hierarchically, right? If you consider the center of the flower as the Four Noble Truths, then the petals of the flower are a response to the suffering of this world and to the idea that you can bring about a cessation of suffering. So in this conception of Buddhism, there's no need to place one school of Buddhism over another. They are all interpretations of the core insight of the Buddha. So what are some of these responses that different schools make to the Four Noble Truths? And there's various models which predominate in different schools. So particularly if you focus on the third noble truth, the third noble truth is that it is possible to bring an end to suffering, the truth of cessation. And this is what made Buddhism so tremendously appealing, This is very attractive. So, I mean, if the Buddha had stopped with the first noble truth, it's like, thanks a lot. There's a lot of suffering, right? So, right? And if he had stopped with the second noble truth, that there is a cause to suffering, that might be interesting in an academic sort of way, but beyond that, it wouldn't have sparked, this powerful vision of existence which swept across Asia, So it is the third noble truth in particular, that it is possible to bring an end to sorrow. It's very interesting because the Buddha himself in the sutras, that's what he focuses on. There's, I'm sorry I can't remember the name of the sutra, but he was often asked what we would call cosmological or metaphysical questions, which were relevant in his day, or phrased in terms that were relevant to his culture. Is the universe eternal? Is the universe finite? Both in time and in space were favorite questions. And he would refuse to answer these questions. And finally, one of his disciples pushed him on this issue, you are the fully awakened one, you are the Buddha, and I ask you this question and you won't answer, surely you have an opinion, what is it? And he said, his response is very interesting. He said that those kinds of questions resemble someone being shot by a poisoned arrow, okay? So people heard this story? It's good to repeat it anyway, even if you've already heard it. So shot by a poisoned arrow. See? Then the doctor comes along and says, I have an antidote to the poison. Right? Okay. So the person who's shot says, no, I want to know who shot the arrow. Because when I get better, I'm going to get him. Okay. I want to know what kind of wood the shaft is made from, what kind of feathers are on the end. And the doctor is going, but I have this antidote, you don't have long hair. So those kinds of, the point he was making, and that he says explicitly, is those kinds of questions do not bring about an end to suffering. He says, yeah, I have an opinion, but that opinion will not bring an end to sorrow. And that is why he would not respond to those questions. There's an interesting result about this. One of the reasons that Buddhism was able to cross cultural barriers, the movements, say, of Buddhism from India to China. India and China are very different cultures. One of the reasons that Buddhism was able to do this is that it doesn't have a strong cosmological commitment. And so when it moves from one culture to another, the cosmology of different cultures does not cause a friction, in Buddhism. Because its central focus is to bring about the cessation of suffering. That is in contrast to Western religious traditions, which tend to have a very strong cosmological commitment, which historically has caused a great deal of friction when those cosmologies have changed. But to return to the overview, so what are some of these responses that different Buddhist traditions have made to the third noble truth, the truth that it's possible to bring a cessation? One of the predominant models in Buddhism is purification. The way you bring about the cessation of suffering is to purify your mind, purify your body, purify your speech, purify your conduct, purify your heart, and when all that purification is accomplished, then you'll be enlightened. Okay? So this model, we're talking about a long time here. Usually it's written as eons of time. We're not talking about like 5 years, graduate school. No, it's like so we're talking about like life after life after life after life of purification. So inherent in this model is the idea that cessation means to put out. Okay. The second noble truth is that there is a cause to suffering. Okay. And the Buddha said that the cause of suffering was craving and clinging. The purification model focuses on craving. Okay. So it is craving which causes suffering. Therefore, I will put an end to craving by bringing about the purification of my psychophysical organism. Yeah? Does this make sense? I mean, you can follow the logic here. Okay? This model also tends to be very monastically oriented. In order to really carry out this program, you have to leave home, and enter into a monastic community. It is the predominant model in Theravada Buddhism, but it is also a very strong model in Mahayana Buddhism. So in Mahayana Buddhism, the purification will be integrated into the image of the Bodhisattva, but basically the program is the same. Interestingly enough, this has resulted in the earliest forms of aversion therapy I know of. So for example, if craving for food arises in the mind, here's an antidote to craving for food. So you are to envision vomit. So then that will repel your desire for food. See? So, no doubt. So if craving for sex arises in your mind, then you visualize the object of your desire is full of shit and pus and various disgusting bodily fluids, and that will be an antidote to your craving for sexual desire. Yeah? Pretty cool, huh? So, what?
Did this come from the Buddha, or is this some sort of interpretation?
This is an interpretation. So, and so you can see how this works and why monks are so cranky. But seriously, it is. All kidding aside, it is a very strong model. The purification model is a very strong model in Buddhism, and once again, the interpretation of cessation means to put out or extinguish. And this interpretation of the Four Noble Truths extends even to nirvana itself, where this interpretation of the Buddhist teaching understands nirvana as to extinguish, so that when one finally reaches the ultimate goal of Buddhism, that is to say nirvana, you are extinguished. You exist no more. Yeah? So we can all look forward to that. And so another model, very important in Buddhism, I call the awakening model. Okay? So, I mean, the Buddha means the awakened one. So, this interprets cessation as waking up. So, schools in which this model predominates are Zen, the Zen tradition, Tiantai, and Dzog Chen in the Tibetan tradition. Also, is a very the awakening model is very strong. Here, the idea is that what causes suffering is clinging. Remember, the second noble truth, the truth of causation. The cause of suffering is craving and clinging. This model tends to focus on clinging as opposed to craving. Craving is not seen as the primary problem in this analysis, because as craving appears, if you release it, say, if you let go of it, if you cease to cling to it, then it is not a problem. So the purification model sees the mere appearance of craving as a problem and therefore requiring an antidote. But if you shift your focus from craving to clinging, then certain consequences follow. That if anger appears in the mind, you simply release that anger, it takes some practice. Simply release that anger, and then that letting go is the cessation of suffering. That's how these traditions interpret cessation. That you release whatever appears, and then suffering ceases. So, non-grasping, non-clinging is the practice and the goal and enlightenment itself. All viewed in the same. In this interpretation, cessation is not understood as putting out or extinguishing. It's interpreted as letting go. Nirvana is interpreted as being present in the world without clinging to the world. Okay? So once again, Nirvana is, the two traditions distinguish between what is the ultimate, in that kind of interpretation. Are there questions? Is this meaningful to people? Yeah.
I just want to clarify. So clinging, isn't that so a person who has gotten beyond clinging, isn't it that person never experiences anger? It's just that he's not controlled by the anger?
Correct.
Yeah. But, since they're all working on the model of a circular or spiral model, right, that the 12-fold chain of causation.
Yeah.
And this is the weak link is between craving and clinging. The ones that work on the craving point are trying to catch it that go round. But I think the people working on clinging it effectually lower craving the next go round because they de-energize the whole wheel in that moment.
Do you mean by the next go around, the next life?
Well, the way 12-fold chain is on all those levels of moment by moment to life by life.
Well, certainly those who have adopted the awakening model would agree with you. But my purpose in presenting these models is not to say that one is better than the other, even that one is more efficacious than the other. My purpose in presenting these models is to show that Buddhism has these different interpretations, and that I imagine in this room there are people who would be more inclined to one than to the other. But all of them are rooted in the insight of the Buddha as expressed in the Four Noble Truths. And then you have these various ways of elucidating that. I cracked a lot of jokes about monks, but I consider it a completely valid path or interpretation. Am I responding to your comment? Is that...
Yeah. Well, I think that they both have an effect. One is a little more an effect on craving. I think that you could just say, well, that this person who gets beyond, understands not to attach to his cravings, what doesn't just continue to have the cravings at the same heightened level forever. There is an eventual dying away.
Right.
It's because of the next go round, because of the rebirth and of thought.
Well, the interpretations are not mutually exclusive. It tends to be the case that a particular Buddhist tradition will emphasize a particular model, and it also tends to be the case that those schools who have adopted a particular model will denigrate the others. But what but I would like to suggest is that they are not neither logically nor experientially are they mutually exclusive.
This issue of craving versus clinging seems to maybe touch on the other issue that I was concerned about, which may fit into the area of doubt. It seems as it's described in the Four Noble Truths, it seems that there's a certain imbalance in the sense that one could look at the same experiences and say it's craving that leads to joy. Craving and then the fulfillment of the craving and then an experience of joy. The problem with that, of course, is impermanence, but that seems to fit into the area of clinging rather than craving. So I wondered how that fit into joy in general.
My immediate response to that is that when we are feeling joyful or happy, we are also in dukkha. Okay? So the Buddha was quite aware that people have happy moments, joyful moments, ecstatic moments, moments of elation, but he insisted that those were also permeated by dukkha, which is one of the problems with the word suffering, translating dukkha as suffering. In my opinion, a more efficacious translation of dukkha would be anxious or anxiety. So that our happy moments, our ecstatic moments, are anxious because of impermanence. So it's not, like the Buddha wasn't denying that we actually do feel happy at times. But he insisted that happy moments and sad moments are alike in that they are permeated by dukkha. I mean, in some ways...
Could dukkha be translated as impermanence?
No, that would be anicca. Okay. So there's another word for that. Yeah. Another model I call the transformation model. And the transformation model is strongly operative in Vajrayana Buddhism, okay, including Japanese Shingon Buddhism, most of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and some of the branches of Tendai Buddhism as well. And the transformation model is that it is possible to use whatever energy appears and transform it into compassion. So the operative ideal here is to be a bodhisattva in the world. And this is very tricky, though. So let's go back to anger. In the purification model, anger appears and you apply an antidote to it. So an antidote to the arising of anger would be to cultivate universal love. Okay? Love for all beings. Okay? So that would be an antidote to the appearance of anger. In the awakening model, anger appears, no problem, let it go through you and pass on, and whatever arises next, simply cease from clinging. In the transformation model, I'll be right with you. In the transformation model, if anger appears, the question is, how can you use the energy of anger for the benefit of other beings? This is very tricky, but there are examples from your own life which will clarify this. So, if you are a parent and you have in the kitchen you have a drawer full of knives, and your kid keeps reaching in there, and you say, "Stop that! Don't reach in that drawer. You might get cut." And then how kids are, they're going to aggravate. They're going to aggravate you. The sixth time they reach in, you slap that hand and you say, "Don't do that. I really mean it. Go to your room." That is an expression of anger, but from the point of view of the transformation traditions, it is an expression of compassion and caring for others. So that anger, the question is, how is anger expressed? The question is it for the benefit of others, or is it, self-centered, for your own benefit? Not always easy to answer. And of course, in many instances, it might be mixed. So in these transformation traditions, the training and the program is to transform these energies, the energy of lust, the energy of greed, the energy of anger, those energies which are normally considered to be bad, in the purification traditions, those energies which you need to get rid of, and by having what is called an ultimate direction for the benefit of others, using those energies to help other sentient beings. It's a tricky path. The reason it's a tricky path is that it's easy to fool oneself. I'm being angry for the benefit of all other beings. Yeah, right. So, that's the great difficulty with this, is how do you check that? How do you look into that? But it is it is a response to the Four Noble Truths. How do you bring about a cessation of suffering? The cessation of suffering is to use the energy for the benefit of others. By dropping away one's self-concern, suffering ceases. Because suffering is seen in this tradition as being self-concerned. It's being, anger rises because I didn't get what I wanted. So I'm pissed. The parent who is angry at their child for reaching into a drawer full of knives is not angry because they didn't get what they wanted. They're angry because the child is in danger and won't listen to them. So that is an expression of love and caring. Those are kind of those two examples. I'm angry because I didn't get what I wanted, and I'm angry out of concern for this child. Those are paradigmatic examples of how to transform that energy. So in these transformation traditions, that's one of the meanings. That you've probably seen those Buddhist paintings of a couple in sexual embrace. How do you transform very intense energies which appear, in the human consciousness for the benefit of others? Very difficult to do. A good contrast between the awakening model and the transformation model is in the use of the intellect. Right? So in the awakening model, like in the Zen tradition, my teacher was never tired of saying, cut off all thinking. Go into my teacher for a koan interview, right? Ask me a koan, and I'd sit there, start thinking, he'd take out a stick, hit me, cut off all thinking. The thinking will not help. Why? Because when you're thinking, you're clinging. See? So thinking and clinging are kind of equated in this tradition. Let it go. Right? So in the transformation tradition, the idea is, how can you use the energy of thinking to benefit others? Discriminative consciousness is normally seen as the primary means by which human beings separate themselves from each other and separate themselves from the rest of existence. But in this tradition, the idea is that thinking itself can be a means for transforming our relationship to existence. All right? But once again, that's very tricky. So if you spin a philosophical system, are you doing this for the benefit of all sentient beings? Or are you doing this because you want everybody to know how brilliant you are? Very tricky. Did you have a question?
Well, just on the purification process, as you described it, it seems like from your description that's based upon primarily on disgust.
I would agree with that.
And if a major motive for transcendence is to focus instead on compassion towards others, it seems like those don't go along very well. If you're walking around full of disgust, it's pretty hard to feel compassion towards others and not include them in the circle of disgust. Right.
The tradition is aware of that problem. Those traditions, they even talk about disgust and cultivating disgust for the world. You know, like the pettiness of the world, the stupidity of the world, all of that is discussed at length. But there are also practices within this tradition to develop loving kindness. So,
you can't have it both ways.
Yeah, well, you may be right. You may be right. But that is how this tradition would respond. They say, well, eventually you reach a point where you can put your disgust aside, but the disgust for the world is a good motivator to begin the practice.
Where would you put inside of Vipassana? The American Vipassana inside?
Oh, American Vipassana is a completely different phenomenon. Well, you see, one of the interesting things is that most Buddhist practices can be placed within any one of these interpretations. See, and that's one of the things which is happening in the United States. So a lot of it depends on the motivation of the practitioner and the motivation of the teacher who is presenting the practice. So, I would place Jack Kornfield in an awakening context. And one more is the model is I call the gratitude model. And this is operative predominantly in the Pure Land tradition of Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism is the dominant school of Buddhism in East Asia, China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan. Numerically, it's by far the largest. And interestingly enough, it is also the first Buddhist tradition to come to the United States. And to give an example of how this is done, there is in certain Pure Land schools a training methodology called Nikon, in which you systematically focus on everything which has been given to you, throughout your life, beginning with your birth, which was given to you, and so gratitude for your parents arises. Then speech was given to you. So gratitude for those, gave you speech. Gratitude for all the meals that have been given to you. So the antidote to suffering in this model, the cessation of suffering is brought about through the cultivation of gratitude. This is the least monastically oriented of the models. This is the least, which is one of the reasons for its widespread appeal, because cultivation of gratitude, this kind of cultivation, does not particularly depend upon a monastic context. You do not have to leave the world to become aware of all that has been given to you. When one becomes consciously, and the purpose of this kind of training is to make it conscious. So if you undergo Nikon training and you say something like, well, I'm very grateful for my parents, and they'll ask you specifically, what did your parents do, that you are grateful for? They don't like to leave it general, or specifically, what did your second grade teacher teach you, that was so important in your life today? So it's pretty thorough, but what happens here is one's sense of self-importance falls away, because one begins to realize that one's life, throughout one's life and one's current life, is a gift from others, and gratitude spontaneously appears. So those are four models, and I'm sure there are many others. The model of purification, the model of awakening, the model of transformation, the model of gratitude. Which do you like? So Buddhism is a very, very rich tradition. But I started out this talk by saying that one of the things that's really that I find really exciting about this group is that the cross current of traditions that is taking place here, and I don't know if the GBF will, have an opportunity to, specifically, bring that up, so that different traditions can speak to each other mutually inform each other. But there is that opportunity here. And in the Orient, there's not much of an opportunity for that. The schools in the Orient tend to stay pretty separately from each other. Not entirely, but one of the wonderful things that's happening in the West now, and particularly in groups like that, is the merging of these traditions. I think something really creative and very fruitful can blossom from that. So,
where do you place things like Kundalini yoga?
I don't know about. I'm not conversant in Kundalini yoga, so I would just. It would be
preparation for the other things, or just sort of getting the body ready to do that.
See, I don't like to comment on things that I don't know anything about. My acquaintance with yoga, is like looking at a few books, right? So I'm really not qualified to say. So, I'm sorry.
I like to say one thing that as Jim Wilson mentioned, that we all came from all different traditions of Buddhism here. And just keep in mind that Buddhism, regardless what tradition you practice or you follow from, we all accept each other. No separation, no line between a different practice from Tibet, from China, from Japan, from Thailand. Therefore, I would like to mention this, keep in mind, no line between each practice. We all open up each other to each other. Because this question will be asked to me when Westerner found out that I was born under Buddhism. The first question they asked me is, what tradition do you practice? That's not a question, it's a question, because that only create the line between two of us. We don't need that one. That's all that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Oh, there's one more question. Yeah.
It seems very unseemly when traditions say they're better than the other traditions. I think that is very un-Buddhist, and I just wonder if they have any reflection on that themselves. That when they're saying we're at the top, I mean, it's obviously it goes to the heart of Buddhist teachings that that humility, that everything's united, everything's interdependent, and so on. It seems like a very egregious ignorance.
I agree with you, but my caveat is that Buddhists are human. And there's a natural human tendency to strongly identify with one's tradition. So, when the Dalai Lama speaks from the Gelugpa point of view, I mean, he does say that the Gelug school is, the best. And my teacher definitely thought that Zen was it. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. And because if you look at the history of Chinese Buddhism, it's very interesting. How over the centuries, one by one, all the different interpretations of Buddhism became integrated into an overall Buddha Dharma. When I was in Korea, which follows very closely Chinese models, you'd go to a Korean Buddhist temple, and there'd be one hall over here for people who wanted to do Pure Land practice. There'd be another hall over here for people who were doing sutra study. And then there'd be a hall over here for people who were doing Zen meditation. But they all considered themselves, Buddhists, members of the Chogye order or something like that. So I think over time, the world's getting smaller, and it'll be more and more difficult for people to maintain that kind of, but I'm that kind of separation. But I'm relaxed about people, if people have a commitment to their own tradition, I mean, I'm okay with that. And that's just how they understand it. Is that a?
You put it the best possible way.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for one thing you said, and this might be something we can talk about sort of in this group specifically, but when you sort of offered this image of the lotus, with all these different traditions that are being stacked up, which is the way I've always heard it. And you're right, where whoever's telling you always somehow their tradition.
Right.
But as you were sort of offering this idea of a lotus and all this little leaves, the flower, I was thinking to myself, well, of course it took a homosexual to come up with that.
I'm going to let that one go. That's very nice insight.
Sort of hierarchy, the whole thing, is something that we as gays are particularly maybe good at. Maybe we've had a little bit of experience with having to do that in our lives, So I don't know if that's a legit way of, I don't know if you thought of it that way, I don't know if that occurred to anybody else that way, but it seems sort of specifically queer to me, in a way that I really liked, felt proud of. And
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for very heartfelt Dharma sharing. Since the day I became a Buddhist practitioner, since the day I chose the path, I have felt honored because I happened to find a teacher that was not alive and alive for all schools. The difficulty for me in search for Sangha is that I have moved from a number of Sanghas. I started with the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order here, who introduced me to you guys. I then founded an all-black Sangha, black male Sangha, for a while, and have gone to Diamond tradition, have gone to Nichiren simply because most Buddhists that meet me assume I'm a Nichiren social practitioner because I'm African American.
Right.
And I thought, what's going on with those guys? I better go see what I'm missing. I better see what the party's like.
The Tina Turner syndrome.
How it's generally described, and I'm always encountered something Alan said, amazed at how casually many American Buddhists describe that school of Buddhism, which I found actually quite compassionate, very loving. I have been trained in all the major schools and practiced most of the traditions and always feel richer as a result of that and always feel humble and aware of how much I don't know and how much there is to know. I think most importantly for me, I walk the path because it's the only thing I've seen that works so far. What frightens me in America is that we have a tendency to compartmentalize everything. It's our paradigmic construct. And I find that transcends race even in America. There was a time when I could blame it all on white people, but we all do it. This is the challenge that this group has. We have the ability, if we choose to take all of those wonderful, rich traditions, as the Buddha said, take what works for us and come up with a path that's genuinely unique and literally fly if we want to. And I can't thank you enough for all of your affirming talk this morning, and certainly all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very beautiful. I also have a great fondness for the Nichiren tradition. I have friends who have their lives has been saved, no question, by that practice. And I didn't talk much about the Nichiren tradition, but yeah. So thank you. That's very beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.